So tonight's talk is by Sir Max Hastings, and he will be talking about his recollections of the Falklands War. So without further ado, I'll introduce Sir Max.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Well, it's a huge pleasure to be here, but I'm not quite sure that I would have accepted your kind invitation so quickly if I'd known that there's at least one person who was down south in 1982 and is liable to stand up at any moment and shout balls. But anyway, the 1982 Falklands War was a freak of history, which today, to me, and perhaps also to you, seems almost as remote as the Boer War. Its most important lesson, which other prime ministers have since learnt the hard way through failures, is that success justifies all. We now know just how serious were the blunders by the Thatcher government which led up to the conflict. For a decade and more, there were warnings that the Argentine junta was up to no good. The British government failed to respond either by diplomatic surrender or by military deterrence. The then Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, wonderful man whom I was lucky enough to know well, has described how, when he tried repeatedly to persuade Mrs. Thatcher to address the Falklands issue by negotiation with Argentina, she wagged her finger and said, "Peter, it's absolutely typical of the Foreign Office that you want to give British things away." But for all her declared firmness of purpose, the Prime Minister failed to adopt the logic of her own policy, which was to put forces in place, even a single submarine, to respond to the escalating Argentine military and naval threat. If Britain had lost the Falklands War, the subsequent inquiries would have concluded that defeat was the result of deplorable policy failures by the Thatcher government, in their way as serious as those which caused Britain to become entangled in the Iraq catastrophe in 2003 and in David Cameron's Libyan folly in 2011. But as we know, Britain did not lose in 1982. Following the Argentine invasion of the islands, Mrs. Thatcher launched one of the most remarkable military adventures in modern British history to save her own political neck and, incidentally, the honour and credibility of her country. If that sounds a cynical verdict, consider what would have happened if she had not dispatched a task force to the South Atlantic. Both she and her government in the spring of 1982 were vastly more precarious than we sometimes remember, even before the Falklands crisis broke. Many people believed that she would lose the next general election. Many Tories were still deeply sceptical about both her record and her policy intentions. There's almost no doubt that had she chosen to wave the white flag after the Argentine invasion, she'd have had to resign as Prime Minister. There would have been no legend of the Iron Lady. There would have been no political epitaph for her as Britain's greatest peacetime Prime Minister of the 20th century. It may be said of the Falklands War that the issue itself was quite irrelevant to the real interests of Britain in the last 20 years of the 20th century. It was a tiny, almost ridiculous hangover from empire. It caused us to invent, after the fact, a strategic interest in the South Atlantic, which we never recognized before the war, and to fortify it at a cost which today has exceeded 15 billion to justify the fighting of the war. But it may also be argued, and I think it would be by me, that it was cheap at the price, because it empowered Margaret Thatcher to do extraordinary things for Britain during the years which followed. But what I'm going to talk about tonight isn't the politics, it's the nature of the quite extraordinary military operation, which for me and many others who sailed the South Atlantic proved one of the great romantic adventures of our lives. The day the Argentine invasion of the islands happened, I was sitting at home in the country working on a book about D-Day in June 1944. I was trying to make the leap of imagination that's essential to all writing of that kind, to think what it must have been like to be crouched in a landing craft heading for a hostile shore. When I first heard that Mrs. Thatcher was sending a task force, I thought it sounded crazy. The idea that we might fight a war in the year of our Lord 1982 for a meaningless piece of real estate at the opposite end of the Atlantic sounded beyond bonkers. I was then more or less out of the newspaper business. I'd not been to a battlefield since the fall of Saigon 7 years earlier. I had no plans ever to do so again. I was 36, which was getting a bit old for running very quickly in either direction under fire. But the more I thought about it, and the more I thought that if Britain was to send a task force to fight what would surely be the last colonial war in its history, I had to be there to see it happen. I'd always regretted not being alive to go up the Nile with Kitchener in the war with the Dervishes in 1898. Having missed that experience, the next best thing seemed to be to go to the South Atlantic, by proxy at least, with Mrs. Thatcher to fight the Argentines. I moved heaven and earth to get a billet with the amphibious force. All my friends among the veteran war correspondents thought I was bonkers. They couldn't believe there really would be a war. Several said to me, "Max, you'll waste weeks of your life sailing in circles around the Atlantic and then come home having done nothing." They believed that they could do what most star reporters do in these situations: sit at home while the diplomatic game was played out and then fly to join the action if war really beckoned. It never occurred to them, or to me, that this wouldn't happen, that the only journalists who would be permitted, indeed privileged, to witness the war in the Falklands would be those who sailed from Southampton that Easter weekend of 1982. We were a small group, among whom some of the broadcasters were experienced war reporters, like my old colleague Mike Nicholson of ITN. But the newspaper representatives were newsdesk hands dispatched by their titles simply to keep the story warm, so to speak, until the time came to send their stars if things got serious. In those early days, there was a lot of talk about 3 Commando Brigade sailing to war in a luxury liner, P&O's Canberra. In truth, almost every hint of comfort, and certainly every vestige of culinary talent, was taken out of that ship before we sailed. The Royal Navy was bitterly hostile to taking any correspondence to sea at all. The admirals wanted to go south, fight the war, and then tell the world afterwards who'd won. Having been obliged by Downing Street to take some journalists, they first allotted us berths in the Indian stokers' quarters in the bilges of Canberra. Only when a press officer with difficulty persuaded the senior naval officer on the ship that this might have an unfavourable impact on our coverage of the Royal Navy were we grudgingly moved higher up and eventually found cabins in which we spent the next long, dreary 6 weeks at sea. The Royal Marines and paras aboard, of course, spent that time training. Each morning at 7, squads of supremely fit young men pounded round the promenade deck, wearing T-shirts of shocking political incorrectness and chanting, "We are strong, we are tough, because we eat our Wheatie Puffs." As for me, I was ashamed of my flaccid, white, early middle-aged body and got up 2 hours earlier to run alone. I knew that if we were to fight, I needed to be in a lot better shape than I had been as a mere civilian writer occupying a desk in Northamptonshire. We spent countless hours in the Crow's Nest bar with the officers, speculating about what might or might not happen. Our own news came from BBC World Service. Every day, as we ploughed south, we heard of the fluctuating fortunes of the diplomacy. And every day, the possibility that we might really fight. seemed to become just a little more real. Although I joined this extraordinary expedition because I wanted to witness the action, now as it grew closer, I started feeling scared. I thought somehow I'd survived a lot of wars when I was younger without a scratch, but I wondered if I'd pushed my luck too far by signing up for just one more. One occasion at sea, I'll always remember, the band of the Royal Marines in full dress uniform staged a concert on the deck of Canberra. It was a beautiful tropical evening, far out on an empty ocean, save for the rest of the little amphibious convoy and our frigate escorts. Thousands of young men crowded the ship's upper works as the band played all the great military and naval standards, sailing, of course, which became a sort of theme tune of the expedition, Hearts of Oak, Rule Britannia. I sat entranced, moved as we all were by the spell of the moment. The world was watching, wondering where we were. We represented the commitment of all the hopes and residual military power of our nation, engaged in the sort of venture that British forces had undertaken 100 times before in our history. Now, surely for the last time, we were doing it all again. I felt a deep sense of privilege to be there at that moment with those men whom I respected and indeed loved so much, to witness a unique drama. All my own doubts and even skepticism about the purpose of the expedition were set aside. I just wanted to see us do this thing, win, and myself have a chance to describe it in terms worthy of those who would do the business. The first real crisis of the amphibious operation came within days of the initial naval clashes, the sinking of the cruiser Belgrano, the loss of the Sheffield. We knew now that we were going to fight and to land in the Falklands. It was necessary to move 3 Commando Brigade from Canberra and the ferry Norland onto the assault ships. But how to do it? It was vital to conserve helicopter hours, which had already been dangerously stretched, moving supplies from ship to ship. There was serious talk of transshipping 3,000 men, one, by breeches buoy, winch and pulley, which would have been a nightmare. Then was a miracle, the South Atlantic, through which we've been ploughing amid heavy seas for so many days and indeed weeks, suddenly lapsed into a near-flat calm. For 8 hours, long columns of men filed down through the big ships to galley ports by the waterline and leapt by one into landing craft, pitching aside. There was one little drama in the one into which I just jumped when the man 2 or 3 behind me slipped and fell between the landing craft and the Canberra. We all thought he was a goner, but a very swift-thinking NCO told everybody to grab their rifles and fend off, and somehow he was fished out of the drink, not much worse for the experience. The next day, the 20th of May, was one of the most critical days in the whole war, although we didn't quite know how critical until later. As we closed on the islands, we knew that we had no air superiority. But before the whole thing began, everybody had agreed we must achieve air superiority in order to be able to carry out a landing, but it hadn't happened. But it was decided to take the huge risk of pushing on through fog. I remember Jeremy Larkin, the captain of Fearless, say the forecasters say we should have a good clag tomorrow, and so on the 20th we did. But all through that day, when we could barely see 100 yards from one ship to the next, there we were ploughing through the waters of San Carlos in this dense fog. And up on the bridge of Fearless, that through the ship's, not the ship's broadcast system, but the captain's broadcast system, we could hear the reports occasionally of enemy aircraft spotted on the radar 200 miles west, whatever it might be. And all through we knew that if the Argentine Air Force found us, if the fog suddenly lifted, that we were going to be in a terrible mess. We didn't know how bad a mess, of course, until days later when the Argentine Air Force started sinking ships in a very serious way. But that day of the 20th, It was nail-biting stuff all through that day. And yet the miracle happened. The Argentine Air Force didn't get to us. And at nightfall, I went below and fell asleep and woke and went back on deck. And there one saw the dim silhouette of San Carlos coastline. And this place of which we've been dreaming for so many weeks, suddenly there it was in front of us in the darkness with all these darkened ships. War is full of cliches. As we all descended through the hatches into the landing craft, all the sailors were saying all those things. Good luck, mate, give them hell. 6 weeks after sitting in Northamptonshire, imagining what D-Day must have been like, here one found oneself part of this miniature impersonation of D-Day, crouched in a landing craft, shivering like hell, as was everybody, and everybody in a fight to try and get as close as they could to the engines at the stud, and everybody, journalists included, clutching a case of mortar bombs, which was the price of our passage. We got to the shoreline, we came ashore, we found the SBS patrol, which had been watching San Carlos for days and indeed, I think, weeks, waiting on the shoreline for us. And we made our way up the beach to the settlement of San Carlos. And I made sure I was with the young officer who was knocking on the door of Pat Short, the settlement manager. And he knocked on the door and one waited for this great moment of drama. And then Pat Short's head emerged and he said, "Oh, you guys have turned up, have you? We've been expecting you for the last 2 days." There was then another of these scenes that there was a solemn raising of the Union flag in the middle of the settlement, in the middle of the night. But of course, the next morning, Thatcher wanted a picture, and in the darkness, there'd been no picture. So they had to do the whole thing all over again for the photographers. For the next few hours, everybody was digging in, cooking. I think one of the things I often think that writers about war don't take account of the fact that all soldiers in all wars spend far more time digging than they do fighting or doing anything very constructive. And I've never been a very good digger, and I remember not being on that particular morning. But that's what you have to do. And one will never forget how grateful we are when the Argentine Air Force started appearing that we had done the digging. Cooking, I remember those. I'm sure nearly everybody here will remember those wonderful petrol pressure cookers. And when the dawn came up and one saw a row of those petrol pressure cookers on the shoreline, and I don't know what ghastly mess they were heating up, but seeing them, having seen them so many times in camps back in UK or on the Black Mountains or the Brecon Beacons, somehow you sort of knew it was all part of Britain when you saw the petrol pressure cookers going on the shore at San Carlos. And then, of course, the air attack started, the jets streaking in, the bombs detaching, everything seeming to happen in slow motion, and ships sinking. I'd never seen a ship sink. I'd seen quite a lot of action in various places, but I'd never seen that happen. And it was very sobering, I think, for all of us as we watched successive ships sink. And one day I was on the shoreline at San Carlos, and there was a young Royal Marine standing beside me as we were watching one of the landing ships smoking like hell after being hit. And he said, "Gore," he said, "if it goes on like this, we're going to have to get the Yanks down here to help us." And I said, "I'm terribly sorry, I don't think the Americans are coming. We're going to be all on our own." And it's very easy now because we all know how the whole story came out. We didn't know then how it was going to come out. And when we saw what was happening, the hammering that we were taking at San Carlos and the ship sinking, and above all, I always remember the night when they hit the stores dump and the ammunition dump over at Ajax Bay. And I went over with Julian Thompson in an inflatable, and there one was standing there with Julian looking frankly pretty rattled as when he might be as we watched all this stuff exploding around us. And you think of how many helicopter hours and hours with the rafts had been spent bringing all this stuff ashore, and there it was after a couple of Argentine bomb hits going up in smoke. And I felt one absolutely consistent strand in my view of that war. I felt a huge admiration for Julian Thompson. What almost everybody here knows, that actually a brigadier is quite a junior rank in the grand scheme of things. And it was actually imposing a huge responsibility on him to send somebody of that level to take sole responsibility for this operation, which no matter how many or how few men were involved, still represented an absolutely vital commitment of Britain's armed forces. And the strain that Julian endured when all this stuff about how communications had improved since the Second World War, communications are a curse as well as a blessing. And poor old Julian had to go and spend 2 or 3 hours of every day over at the SATCOM terminal talking to Northwood and getting bollocked for stuff that I don't think Northwood was very understanding about what the reality is, the difficulties of moving stuff around. And all the problems. And Julian, I think, found it very lonely. And I don't think he felt that he got the level of support from Northwood, whatever he said loyally after the war, that he was entitled to. He, of course, is well known, was very against the expedition to Goose Green by 2 para, which Northwood forced on him because they said, we've got to have some action. But in the end, I suppose it could be said, I wasn't at Goose Green, but in the end, Goose Green was a success story because after a tough battle, the Argentines folded, and psychologically it was a critical moment. And Julian was right in the narrow sense that Goose Green being down here was irrelevant to the main thrust of the, and he was right that it wasn't sort of in the book as somewhere that you'd have to take out before you could launch your assault on Standing. But in that peculiar war, in that peculiar situation, it did turn out very well, that it inflicted a blow on the Argentines, and it also was great for the confidence back home, that it was seen that the Argentines, if pushed hard, could fold. But again, at that stage, everybody already, that had only been ashore for a matter of a few days, a week exactly, in fact, and yet everybody was already getting pretty cold and pretty wet. And these were tremendously fit, highly motivated young men down there. But one of the things always in Julian's mind, I think, and always in the command's mind, was time was not on our side, because if we didn't get this thing over pretty quickly, if we got bogged down on the hills on the way to Standing, then we were going to be in deep trouble, because I seem to remember it was Julian saying to me at some point after, he said, you've got to remember, everybody starts off on great form, but every day from here on in, they're deteriorating just a little bit. And so they were. Well, the air attacks on San Carlos, again, I always was struck with the fact the naval officers, who I thought most of whom handled themselves extremely well, but they'd all been brought up on movies like The Cruel Sea. And a lot of them took their scripts from the sort of things that they felt that they ought to be saying. And I remember being on the bridge of one of the frigates during one of the air attacks, and as the Argentine aircraft came in, and the captain saying over the broadcast system, give them hell, chaps, give them hell. Well, it's not a very original thing to say, but what else do you say at these moments, you know? And Jeremy Larkin, at one point, on the Fearless during one of the air attacks, and I adored Jeremy, and I thought he did a great job down there. And I remember Jeremy, after a bomb near missed Fearless, and Jeremy turned to the bridge and he said, there's only one thing to be said for this business. When it's all over and they make the movie, there will be no part whatsoever for Robert Redford. It was a very curious life when I kept commuting between the shore and the ships. And it was really weird that you had 16 hours of darkness. And it was quite extraordinary how, when you got back to the ships on Fearless, the food was great. You've got a glass of wine with your dinner. And the ship's cameraman of Fearless had been filming all day the air attacks. And in the evening, and please don't think this is bullshit, this is the literal truth, by the evening, by the time everybody sat down to eat, that he'd set the videos of the air attacks to music. And so one sat there having supper, and all through the ship's TV system, we were watching the film of the day's air attacks set to music. I mean, it was absolutely surreal. When we started walking, that I was jolly grateful I'd run round and round the deck of Canberra, because it was tough. I mean, I was lucky because I wasn't carrying a weapon and I wasn't carrying ammunition. And so I was privileged. I was able to, I made sure I took 2 or 3 days rations, whereas nobody else had 2 or 3 days rations in their packs. That there came a moment at Teal Inlet where we arrived, I think I'd been marching with 4-5 Commando. And when we got to Teal Inlet, we find 3 Para and Hugh Pike. And by this stage, half the army's boots were falling to pieces. And I saw Hugh Pike looking at my feet in what I could only describe as a rather hungry fashion. And he said, what are those boots you're wearing, Hastings? And I said, well, they're old shooting boots I had made at Lobs many years ago. And he said, they look rather comfortable. I said, they're the only bit of me that's working absolutely perfectly. He said, there's nothing like them out on the ships. And I said, not unless Lobs have set up out there since we came ashore. And he said, well, if anything unpleasant happens to you on this expedition, Hastings, I'll tell you which bit of you I'm going for. Again, it's so important to remember the moments of suspense and of tension. In other words, we know the story came out well, but we didn't know that then. And so, for example, I grabbed a helicopter lift back from halfway across East Falkland up back to the Fearless to send a dispatch. And while I was there, we heard that Coventry and Atlantic conveyor had been sunk. And I remember passing on a ladder somewhere in the depths of the ship, Tom Second, the Deputy Brigade Commander. And Tom said laconically, well, there goes Thatcher's government. And Tom really believed that the British public would turn on the whole venture after you get that kind of hit in a single day. But Michael Rose actually was seen as a great advantage at that moment, and I admired him enormously for some of the things he said. One of them, and it may even have been that night, there we all are drinking in the wardroom, pretty gloomily. And Michael came in. This is the CEO of 22 SAS. And Michael came in, and after listening to us for a bit, he said, I don't know what all the fuss and why you're all looking so gloomy. He said, nobody sent us down here with a divine right to score all the goals. He said, it's their turn today, but it may be our turn again tomorrow. You've just got to bugger on. And he was absolutely dead right, and I very much admired him for saying that that night. And Michael did me a big favour a day or two later, when he'd already got one squadron up on Mount Kent, which is the highest point on the island. And he suddenly asked me if I'd like to come with him up to the top of Mount Kent, which then seemed like the other side of the moon. And of course I felt I had to say yes. But when we loaded up for this expedition, I was absolutely terrified, because as we SAS and some men from 4-2 Commando got into the Sea King, or in fact there were 3 Sea Kings who went up it, and then they chucked in mortar rounds and ammunition and weaponry of one kind or another. So we were literally sitting up to our waists, and being a pessimist, I thought, well, if anything unpleasant happens to this helicopter on our way to Mount Kent, then the chance of getting out of here are absolutely zero. But again, Michael, living up to the image. And again, please do not think, I may talk nonsense this evening, but I'm not, everything I tell you is the truth as I vividly remember it. And as we were flying at 0 feet, and remember, passive night goggles were pretty new stuff then, and these were American stuff that had been given to these guys only a week or two before for night flying. And there we are, hedge hopping across the, well, no hedges, but hopping across the contours of East Falkland. And I leaned over and I yelled to Michael, what happens if the RGs start stonking the landing zone? And Michael leaned back and he said, oh, well, who dares wins? Oh, yes, oh, yes. And it's very difficult to stay scared when you're in the company of people who behave like that. There was one of the things about that whole experience, there was an intimacy about it all. One thing one realized, the 70s have been a bloody awful time in Britain, as some of you will remember. And we'd all got accustomed to failure and to the country not being able to make a car that anybody really wanted to buy, and everything going wrong, and the economy a chronic basket case. And now suddenly, First of all, one was seeing the Brits doing something terribly well. And secondly, that everybody was trying to help each other. And that's terribly moving when you think of the essential selfishness of an awful lot of life back in the UK or in any society in peacetime. And that was terribly moving. That I remember a moment on a landing craft when I was catching a ride from them at dawn one morning to go back and send a dispatch from the shore. And I was sitting there feeling pretty sorry for myself because I hadn't slept for a couple of nights. And suddenly a head popped out of the hatch of this landing craft, and he said, "You look pretty hungry. Bacon and eggs any good?" And I said that would be absolute heaven. And he disappeared back down below and handed up bacon and eggs. I practically burst into tears. One was so moved by the kindness, and I almost did burst into tears when about 4 days later that landing craft was sunk by Argentine aircraft, and they lost all the crew. Anyway, up on Mount Kent, it was one of the worst nights I can ever remember. We did land into a firefight, which was a fine old mess, but the SAS coped with it without too much problem, and peace was restored, if you call it that. But nobody could sleep that night, and I just remember shivering for hours and hours and hours through that night. And you thought the night would never end, but you couldn't sleep. We were all so cold and wet. Well, eventually dawn did come, and we landed about, I don't know, half a mile below the summit. And everybody decided we'd better make our way up to the summit. And during the night, they got one gun up there with, I forget how much ammunition, but about 100 rounds. But the other guns, one of the helicopters, the Chinook, had been damaged during the night, hitting a lake while it was on its way up to bring up another gun. And so we were stuck with one gun and however many rounds it was. And that was all they'd get up there until they managed to repair the Chinook. Anyway, we plodded up to the top of Mount Kent. I remember that Nick Vaux, who was up there, another man I thought was absolutely wonderful, CEO of 4-2 Commander, Nick said, "Well, Hastings, you're going to earn your passage on this one. You can jolly well carry a blowpipe up there." And I'd forgotten what a blowpipe weighs, but enough. And I knew I'd been in a fight by the time we got to the top of that damned hill. When we did get to the top, there we are standing on top of Mount Kent, and through binos, you can see Moody Brook, the old Royal Marine base, and you can see Argentines moving around down there. And it was a very clear morning. And Michael Rose said to the gunner battery commander who was up there, he said, "Go on, let's lob a few rounds at them just to show we're in serious business." And the gunner battery commander said, "I'm not too sure about this, that I don't know whether we're supposed to be doing this." And Michael Rose said, "Oh, bugger it, just get on and do it." And sure enough, we did lob a few rounds into Moody Brook, and we had the satisfaction of watching all these guys running like hell in all directions. Well, afterwards I heard there'd been the most frightful row back down the hill because that they were terribly aware at divisional headquarters, brigade headquarters, how exposed we were. There was only this tiny force, part of 4-2 Commando, and one squadron of SAS up there. And if the Argentines had launched a serious counterattack, which we didn't know then that they were incapable of doing, well, we would have been in a lot of trouble. And so they were furious when they heard that Michael had ordered the gunners to fire down at Moody Brook. In case the Argentines were in any doubt where we were, we got away with it, but we didn't deserve to. But again, Michael was arguing all the way through that one good push and they'll fold. I eventually said to him, "Well, I'm terribly sorry, Michael, but I've got to go back down the hill next time a chopper comes up here because I've got to file a dispatch." And he said, "No problem, you can do it on my SATCOM." Well, I'd barely even heard of SATCOMs at that stage. And actually, I wasn't telling quite the truth because I was so bloody cold, I was desperate to get off the top of that mountain. But there I was led into a little pop tent in which a couple of grinning SAS signallers. And I talked to Hereford. I dictated a dispatch to Hereford on a line rather better than one usually used to get between Northampton and London. And at the end of it all, after the officer at the other end who'd taken my dispatch, I said, "Can you do me a favour and call my wife and tell her I'm okay?" Well, I'm not sure that this was a big success, because she said afterwards that she duly had had a call from somebody who said, "I can't tell you who I am or where I'm calling from, but I just spoke to your husband and he's alive," you know. But she didn't find this terribly reassuring. There was also a monumental row back in London because that I'd been able to use SAS communications to send the dispatch, and there were frightful claims were made by rivals that one had been bribing people or suppressing other people's dispatches or whatever. But anyway, it only happened the once, but it was a good story to tell afterwards. By that stage, we were all exhausted. I've been lucky because I've been going back to the ships probably every 3 days, whereas, of course, all the guys out with the Marines and the Paras had not been able to go back, had not been able to get cleaned up or to have a decent meal or whatever. And everybody, Julian knew that it had become essential to try and finish this thing as quickly as possible, because after so many weeks sleeping in the cold and wet, their men were near the limits of their survivability. I looked at those shaggy, filthy, exhausted men with whom as a spectator I'd shared so much, with a love and admiration that has not faded to this day. And I laughed at the memory of all my own doubts and fears about the war and my own part of it. I was simply boundlessly proud to have had the opportunity to watch the British Armed Forces do something tremendously well. The last big attack on the hills around Stanley, I went with 4-2 Commando, an experience that vastly increased my respect and admiration for Nick Vaux, their CO, who planned the attack, which looked suicidal, because we knew the Argentines up on the hill, Mount Harriet, ahead of them, had night vision equipment. And we were up on the opposite hill, and we had to cross about 2 or 3 miles of open ground. And I think I've never lost my admiration for the Royal Engineers, who had gone out by night, again and again, doing what they've done in many wars, but probing for paths through the minefields to clear a way for us. And what they'd done by night in the 2 or 3 days before the attacks was something else again. I was in my normal state of terror as we marched through the night across the open ground towards Mount Harriet, that I thought that Nick planned the attack brilliantly, and it went incredibly successfully. And yes, the Argentines were hardly the Waffen-SS, but they did have a lot of kit up there, and they could have made things very unpleasant for us. And when one saw in the night the amount of stuff that was flying around, both incoming and outgoing artillery, and naval gunfire, that it seemed absolutely astounding that I think we captured Harriet. I forget whether 2 or 3 men were killed and about a dozen wounded, but the casualties were incredibly light considering what they'd done. First light, I was with Nick and the battery commander up on top of Harriet, and again we were looking through binos at Argentines running like hell towards the horizon. And the battery commander started calling down fire on them. He was calling up 200, 5 rounds for effect and so on. You'd see these puffs of smoke a mile ahead towards the horizon, and you'd see the little figures. 1 or 2 of them would fall over, and 1 or 2 of them would run, and 1 or 2 of them. And I turned to him, the battery commander, and I said, "This is a terribly cold-blooded business, isn't it?" And he said, "Yes, but it's jolly satisfying, isn't it?" And of course, we'd all been shit scared through the night. And so I think the general feeling was that it was our turn. And I don't think anybody was in the mood to feel too sorry for the Argentines in that particular situation. Well, after those hills had been taken, I went with 2 para for the last attack of their last attack, the Wireless Ridge. That again, I thought they handled brilliantly. It was superbly well conducted and all right. The Argentines weren't a first-rate enemy. And in fact, I remember one of the Royal Marine colonels saying after the attack on the mountains, he said, "With 50 Germans, I could have died of old age holding this place." And so one could, but they were not. You deal with the opposition you've got. Unfortunately for the British Army and the Royal Marines, the Argentines were just about the sort of opposition we could see off in those incredibly difficult circumstances in which our war was being fought. Anyway, the Wireless Ridge attack, I fell asleep. In fact, I remember being woken up by Chris Keeble, the second in command, at dawn, and he said, "You fell asleep in the middle of my battle." And I said, "I'm terribly sorry, I was terribly tired." Anyway, I walked forward up to join the forward company, and everybody marched onwards until we suddenly come to the edge of a hill, and we suddenly see there below us Port Stanley in the sunshine. Brilliant, lovely day. And Argentines running up the road away from us, and no signs of much opposition. And the colonel who'd taken over from H. Jones, David Chandler, he got the word to continue and advance towards Stanley, and he said, "Right, we'll put one company up on the hill on the opposite face, and a company goes down the road with Dare Farrell Hockley." And I attached myself to Dare Farrell Hockley, and we started marching down the hill and then along the road towards Port Stanley. And everybody was sleepwalking. I mean, I'd had a relatively privileged couple of nights. I had 2 or 3 hours sleep. They'd had none at all. And how they kept going, it was pure adrenaline. And we were going like smoke, and we could hear firing still going on the other side of town. So the war was not completely over, but there was no shooting on our side of town. And we were just passing the racecourse when suddenly a message came through wireless saying, "Order that we've got to stop and wait for negotiations with the Argentines." And there was roars about possible Nelsonian blind eyes and so on, but eventually they all filed aside into the racecourse and started brewing up. And they found vast quantities of cigarettes in the starters' huts, which everybody got going on. It seems like another age, the fact that everybody was smoking all the time. I looked up the road and I could see Stanley Cathedral about half a mile ahead. And there didn't seem to be any shooting going on. So I thought, well, if I can walk up that road and live, I can bore everybody to death for the next 40 years talking about it. And of course, I also knew it was just an old-fashioned journalist stunt. And I thought there was a good chance that the Argentines would not shoot me. I thought they'd lost any sort of spirit for this. And I walked up the road, having had some difficulty getting past the parachute regiment picket on the road. The NCO in charge said, "Where do you think you're going?" And I said, "Well, I'm a civilian." And I'd taken off all my camp gear and all the rest of it so that to try and look, although my face was still blackened. So I wasn't a very convincing civilian. But anyway, I walked up the road with my hands in the air, the Argentine lines. And the closer I got, every step, my legs were struggling to make this work. But finally, 50 yards, I wasn't worried about anybody giving an order to shoot me. I just thought that soldiers in defeat are very dangerous people. And here you've got a defeated army, and you see all these guys who were still armed to the teeth and just needed one pissed off Argentine peasant. And my little stunt would have been terminated pretty briefly. In fact, David Chandler said afterwards he wished they had shot me because he thought what I did was so irresponsible. Long after the war, I got hold of the Argentine officer who had been in command on that side of town. And I asked him why he hadn't shot me. And he said, as far as I knew, you didn't look very military. And he said, as far as I knew, there was no lunatic asylum on the island, so I presumed you had to be a journalist. Anyway, the rest is, I did make it to the Upland Goose, and I did have a drink with them all, and then go back and file a dispatch. And yes, I have been boring everybody to death for the last 40 years talking about it. To understand the significance of the British achievement in the Falklands, it's necessary to remember what the mood of this country was like back in 1982. We'd just come through the 1970s, one of the worst decades in our modern history. We seemed almost a failed state. We couldn't do anything right. Our economy was a shambles, public services on their knees, British business and industry in embarrassment. Those of us who've grown up through that period had become so accustomed to failure that we assumed that for the rest of our lifetimes we'd have to watch Britain continuing relentlessly to crumble and decline. Yet here now in the South Atlantic, we'd seen Britain's armed forces do something supremely well. How could we fail to be deeply moved by the spectacle? And how, indeed, could the British people at home not feel the same? And the rest, of course, is history. The return of the victorious task force prompted a huge surge of elation among the nation, and admiration and enthusiasm for Mrs. Thatcher, the victor, which persisted for many moons thereafter. The Prime Minister had gambled everything. If, as was perfectly possible, we'd lost Canberra with 3 Commando Brigade, or even one of the 2 carriers, the expedition would have been plunged into crisis. If the Argentines had been just a little bit better, they could have kept us bogged down on those hills as the weather worsened and sustained a stalemate. But a combination of courage, skill, and old-fashioned luck gave the day to the British. For sure, there'll be never anything like the Falklands War again. It's wildly unlikely that Britain will fight another conflict alone. It's also unlikely that another adversary will be so foolish as to engage in such an old-fashioned head-to-head encounter with a beginning, a middle, and an end. We've entered the new age of so-called asymmetric warfare. The Falklands was a profoundly old-fashioned war in every way. Even some of the weapons we were using, the Brens and Bofors guns, had seen service in World War II. It was short, sharp, and had a clear outcome. I've always thought that if it had dragged on inconclusively, if there'd been a long stalemate on the hills, the will of the British people would not assuredly have remained solid. Modern electorates are chronically fickle and impatient, abetted in this by the media. I return to the point I made at the beginning. Success justifies all. Nobody wanted nasty answers to the tough questions about why the Falklands had to be fought, about the massive government blunders which preceded it in the euphoria after our success. As Mrs. Thatcher said after the recapture of South Georgia, just rejoice. In my view, if Iraq today was stable and peaceful, nobody would give a damn about weapons of mass destruction. It's because Tony Blair's great gamble failed, where Margaret Thatcher's triumphantly succeeded, that her legacy, his legacy, is cursed by his war and indeed by Afghanistan, while Thatcher's is wreathed in triumphant laurels by hers. I must end with a word about Britain's armed forces, which I've always loved so well, and never more so than during the South Atlantic War. The Navy, Marines, Paras, Guards. Nothing has caused many of us greater distress and anger in recent years than to perceive the criminal neglect, both human and financial, with which the armed forces have been treated by recent governments. When so many other national institutions have been called into question, the British Army has remained a beacon of courage, professionalism, and honour. But it will not long continue to do so unless it receives vastly more convincing support from the government and indeed from the British people. It's intolerable to send British troops to fight with inadequate armoured vehicles, far too few helicopters, far too few men come to that. It becomes even more so when some of their wounded were shockingly neglected on their return to this country, and when some chiefs of staff, who should know better, kept silent in the face of government follies rather than speak out. We shan't again have to fight such a war as the Falklands, but we shall surely need our armed forces to defend us in a 21st century that looks more dangerous by the day. If we persist with present policies, they won't be able to do so. All those of us who've been privileged to see the British Army and Royal Navy in action at their best know how good that best can be. The commemoration of the Falklands War that most of us wish to see today, 42 years on, is that the spirit of the fighting men who achieved that remarkable victory should be kept alive in the 21st century for future national emergencies which are certain to come, though every modern British government makes defence policy and allocates defence budgets as if they will not. Thank you all very much.